What drives us to obtain riches in terms of land from those who have been there long before us?
What drives us to claim what is supposedly ours by means of a scribble on a piece of paper? What drives us to besiege people and justify their mistreatment?
What drives us to say we are based upon freedom when we take it from others?
What drives us? Is it the feeling of our greed, even though we know it is wrong? Even if we see it is wrong.
The calm before the storm. 1813 through 1814, the Creek War stirred in the South. In 1813, Red Sticks, native Creeks who remained traditional to the culture, fought against the Kawata Creeks who were assimilated into American society. The people were in disarray and disunity. This caused them to fight against each other. This gave the U.S. an advantage by not fighting against a united Native American force. The Kawata and the U.S. soldiers pushed back the Red Sticks in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 under General Andrew Jackson. 800 Red Sticks died. Amongst the attack was Osceola. He and his mother fled to Florida, where they joined the Seminoles. He was to become one of the leaders in the coming wars. First Seminole War, 1817 through 1818. Many Native Americans were pushed south to Spanish Florida due to white encroachment, and there was a constant push on Indian removal. The U.S. South wanted more land. Along with these events, runaway slaves joined the movement to reach Florida.
Imagine if, your iPhone, your car, your watch said, you know what? I don't want to do this job anymore. I'm out, I'm leaving, and they take off. I mean, you probably miss that watch, right? You probably miss that iPhone. You probably miss that car. It would make your life a little bit more difficult to get around, to know what time it is, to call your friends, all of those types of things. As crass and horrible as that might be to equate human beings to that, for white slave owners, for them, that's what it was when slaves would escape.
The tropical swamplands created a sense of security for those who escaped slavery. Both of these oppressed people learned how much they had in common. Native and African peoples saw family values and bonding to be more important than economic profit. This very bond was found threatening by the white inhabitants of the South. A free population of people both oppressed by Americans with possible access to weapons cultivated fear.
The efforts to recapture runaway slaves in Spanish Florida contributed to what brought the Seminole forces and the U.S. to war in 1817. The slave was seen as a form of property in the South. The white Southerners bought slaves and had them work their plantations to make money. Without slaves, the South could not function. So being able to control African American slaves got white Southerners heavily involved in retrieving their slaves and preventing their slaves from escaping. The Spanish offered freedom to those who would defend the Spanish territory of Florida. This freedom land of Florida posed a threat to the American South, which thrived off of the slave system. If the slaves were lost, their system would be lost. During the time of James Monroe's presidency in 1818, Andrew Jackson took soldiers into Georgia to seek justice after the Seminole attack in Fort Scott, Georgia. After this, General Andrew Jackson disregarded orders and did what he thought was right. He led his army to destroy many native villages and free black communities that were living alongside the Seminoles.
The blacks and Indians fought side by side in a desperate struggle to stop the American advance, but they were defeated and driven south into the more remote wilderness of central and southern Florida. Opala wrote,
The Seminoles is not the name applied to only one Native American tribe. Rather, it is the name applied to a number of Indian tribes and also the African slaves as well. There's this long-standing fear about the alliance of African slaves and the Native Americans.
Jackson went on to capture the fort of Pensacola in May 28, 1818, and then Fort St. Mark's. Without a strong presence of the Spanish, the Seminoles and runaway slaves had no one to turn to. They had to hold their own now. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 allowed the U.S. to purchase Florida from the Spanish, and the U.S. forgave the Spanish debts to the U.S. Now, all of Florida, home to many Seminoles and runaway slaves, was in the hands of the U.S. Due to continuous efforts of the U.S. to gain Native American land, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was enacted and was supported by President Andrew Jackson. This caused many Native Americans, including the 5 civilized tribes, to be moved westward by escorts of the U.S. on the Trail of Tears. U.S. soldiers came to round up natives from their homes to begin their journey west of the Mississippi River. Children, elderly, and the many were sent west. But there were some that stayed in resentment of leaving their homeland.
The Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. Days Massacre, December 28, 1835. Osceola led his Seminole forces against Fort Brooke, Florida, where Major Dade and his American soldiers were. The Seminoles surrounded the fort and killed all but 2 U.S. soldiers. This started the Second Seminole War. In the first months of 1836, Africans and Seminoles bonded together and rose to fight against the Americans who were invading southern lands. The Africans and Seminoles successfully raided plantations on the East Coast and held their own against the invading Americans for a while. This called General Thomas Sidney Jessup to take charge in the war in Florida in October 1836. Now, with General Jessup in command, with another conflict started, the U.S. put the resources together to now claim their land from the Indians. Cavalry, an army, and supplies were brought down to Florida to aid in the Second Seminole War.
Document number 265. Assuming there will be 2,000 mounted and 2,000 serving as infantry, that they will be allowed the pay of dragoons, and such as are mounted will receive but 20 cents each per day for the use of his horse, that those now in service, having volunteered but for 6 months, there will be 2 terms of service, and, consequently, a double allowance for traveling and clothing, to which is added the amount required for rearranges for 1837. Respectfully, your obedient servant, Hon J.R. Pontiet, Secretary of War.
There were conflicts amongst the various tribes in Florida, whether to surrender or keep fighting. Different chiefs took on their own decisions on surrendering, such as the Seminole leader, Micanopy. Another large tribe was the Miccosukes, led by Osceola, which were more involved in the war and were blamed for further conflict, such as the Battle of Palacalcaha. This battle closed the Second Seminole War under General Worth.
The African Americans and Seminoles fought their oppressors who sought to keep control and reap their benefits for themselves.
As the years continued on, more Seminoles and U.S. soldiers died fighting the swamplands of Florida.
Millions of dollars spent funding the war finally got the U.S. to gain a foothold.
The Seminoles were moved west and the slaves back into plantations. Those who still fought became fewer and fewer. They were driven deeper and deeper into the swamplands towards the Everglades.
The coming years would see more and more U.S. soldiers take up land, and a third war would arise.